At the end of this topic, you will be able to define heredity, inheritance, traits, list out the characters chosen by Mendel on pea plant, explain the monohybrid cross with checkerboard, distinguish allele from allelomorph, detail the variation with its types and its role in evolution, compile the life history and research interest of Gregor Johann Mendel. The genetic transmission of characteristics from parents to offspring is called heredity. Variation is the change in the characteristics between the individuals or between the groups of population. Inheritance in biology is the process in which an offspring possesses the determined characteristics of its parent. The morphological, anatomical, physiological, and reproductive characteristics passed through inheritance are called as traits. The basic rule of inheritance is both the parents are equally contributing in passing a trait to their progeny. Parents are passing their genetic traits via DNA to their offspring. Gregor Johann Mendel worked out scientifically for the first time on heredity and variation in pea plant, Pisum sativum, which he had cultivated in his monastery garden. Mendel was curious to get the results of crossing various traits. He chose 7 contrasting characters for his study and worked out continuously on that. The 7 contrasting characters were as follows. Shape of the seed with 2 contrasting characters such as round and wrinkled. Color of the seed with 2 contrasting characters such as yellow and green. Color of the flower with 2 contrasting characters such as violet and white. Pod shape of the fruit with 2 contrasting characters such as full and constricted pods. Pod color of the fruit with 2 contrasting characters such as green and yellow. The position of the flower in a plant with 2 contrasting characters such as axillary and terminal. The height of the plant with 2 contrasting characters such as tall and dwarf. Mendel selected the Pisum sativum plant with 2 different heights for his observation. Pea plants generally produce seeds by self-pollination, and he noted that the tall plants produced always tall plants generation after generation and dwarf plants produced always dwarf plants generation after generation under natural condition. Mendel termed them as wild types or pure breeding varieties. Mendel crossed the pure breeding tall and dwarf variety of pea plants. He crossed a tall plant with a dwarf plant for subsequent generations and calculated the percentage of tallness and dwarfness. When a pure breeding tall plant was crossed with a pure breeding dwarf plant, all plants were tall in the first filial generation, F1, and dwarf character was not appearing at all. He self-crossed the F1 generation to check whether dwarf characters will express in the next generation. As he expected, dwarf character was expressed in F2 generation with the ratio of 3 tall plants and 1 dwarf plant. At the end of the experiment, he concluded that dwarf character was suppressed in the F1 generation but expressed in the subsequent generation with meager percentage. He termed phenotype as an expression of morphological characters as tall or dwarf, red or white flower, and genotype as the expression of the gene or chromosomal makeup of an individual for a particular trait.
Mendel's monohybrid cross. Gregor Johann Mendel is called the father of genetics. His contributions to the study of inheritance paved the way for our basic understanding of how traits are inherited from one generation to the next. Mendel suspected that heredity depends on contributions from both parents and that specific characteristics from each parent were passed on rather than being blended together. For his experiment, Mendel selected 7 visible characters, each with 2 contrasting traits. Let us see the 7 pairs of contrasting traits in P used by Mendel for his experiment. First character is the seed shape. It is round in the dominant trait and wrinkled in the recessive trait. Second character is the seed color, which is yellow for the dominant trait and green in the recessive trait. The 6th character is the flower position, for which the dominant trait is axillary and the recessive trait is terminal. Before making a cross between 2 flowers, we need to know the different parts of. Mendel made a crossover by taking and introduced it into the stigma of the recessive parent. The simplest of the crosses conducted by Mendel is called monohybrid cross, which consisted of plants. During this crossover, each parent produces gametes of only one kind, either tall or dwarf, and these combine at fertilization to form plants that uniformly have. When the F1 generation plants self-pollinate, they produce 2 kinds of gametes, capital T, In the F2 generation, 4 plants are produced, among which 3 plants are tall and 1 is dwarf. This constitutes the phenotypic ratio 3:1 and the genotypic ratio. Mendel's monohybrid cross can be represented by the checkerboard method with phenotypic and genotypic ratio as shown here.
The genotype of a character is determined by factors later called as genes. Genes are the main physical basis for inheritance of characters. The contrasting expressions of the single gene are called alleles. Contrasting pair of alleles forms an allelomorph. Tall and dwarf plant and white and violet colored flowers are alleles. Height of the plant and color of the flower is an allelomorph. Organisms differ or vary in expressing their phenotype is the key factor for variation. No two individuals are identical to each other and they are unique in their own ways. The difference in the characteristics among the individuals is called variation. Variation may be within the same species called as intraspecific variation or between different species called as interspecific variation or among the different genera called as intergeneric variation. Asexual reproduction produces more or less resembling offsprings which result in minor variations. Sexual reproduction brings about remarkable, significant and visible variations. Somatic variations are pertained to body cells and are not inherited. Germinal variations are pertained to gametes and are inheritable. Germinal variations pave the way for speciation and evolution. Variation is the raw material for evolution. Variation makes animals to adapt themselves to the changing environment. It brings out the best in animals to face the struggle for their existence. Individuality of an organism is well maintained. Variation is a keystone for heredity, otherwise all individuals of a race would be identical in all aspects. Gregor Johann Mendel lived between 1822 and 1884. Mendel was an Austrian Augustinian monk by profession. He was educated in a monastery and went on to study science and mathematics at the University of Vienna. He failed in teacher training examination, but it did not suppress his thirst on experimental research. He turned to monastery and became a pastor but adoring gardening and research. He started growing peas on his monastery garden. Many others had studied the inheritance of traits in peas and other organisms earlier, but Mendel blended his knowledge of science and maths and was the first one to explore the scientific method of keeping the count of an individual's exhibiting a particular trait in each generation. This helped him to frame the laws of inheritance and gave him the title Father of Genetics posthumously. In this topic, you have learnt heredity is the genetic transmission of characteristics from parents to offspring. In inheritance, offspring possesses the determined traits of its parents. Gregor Johann Mendel, father of genetics, worked out scientifically on pea plants on his monastery garden, selected 7 different alleles, observed generation after generations, and concluded his genetics work mathematically for the first time. In his monohybrid cross experiment, he selected tall and dwarf plant and observed F1 and F2 generations and concluded with the phenotypic ratio of tall and dwarf as 3:1 respectively. He termed gene as factors and its expressions as genotypes. He mentioned alleles are the contrasting expressions of the single gene and genes are the physical basis of inheritance too. Every organism differs from the other of their own species, which is called as variation. Asexual reproduction shows minor variations, whereas sexual reproduction expresses significant variation. Variation may be somatic or germinal, and it is the raw material and keystone for evolution.